Fantastic. And welcome to day 3, I think is a fair way to describe it, of the World Government Summit in 2017. As I was speaking to Mona Al-Mari about how the evolution has gathered pace here at the World Government Summit. Last night on air for CNN, we were doing the show with Becky out here in the foreground, in the courtyard. We were suggesting it's the equivalent of the Middle Eastern Davos. I think it's a very fair comment, bringing together thought leaders on the most important subjects of today. Now, as the moderator on this track, 75 minutes that we have together today, I was thinking, how do I put everybody under one umbrella? And I'm starting to overuse this word, but it's radical, right? So we're going to have a discussion about radical innovation and entrepreneurs from Kathleen Kennedy. Radical curiosity, which I think is going to spark your interest to round out our 3 sessions this morning with Paul Bennett of IDEO or IDEO. And it would be very lazy for me to suggest it would be about radical Islam in our first conversation. In fact, it's exactly the opposite. It's about tolerance in the 21st century, which has been a challenge. For those, and I think everybody in the room attended the session with His Highness Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid Al Maktoum, which was, I described on air last night as almost a fireside chat. It reminded me of the period between 1930s and 1940s for those who have studied American history with FDR and his radio broadcast at night. It was an open arena, taking questions from throughout the Middle East and North Africa and asking the question, why? We have a market of better than 300 million consumers. Why isn't the whole region doing much better? And despite the uncertainty we see in this neighborhood today, is this region ready to reboot and take advantage of the next stage of growth as a bridge between East and West? Our first topic of conversation is probably the most important that we're witnessing in the region today, and I would argue that resonates throughout the world, and that is the stream of radicalism, the stream of populism that we see in the United States and Europe today, and even populism in terms of the legislation that's coming out in the early days of the Trump administration. Let's welcome to the stage for a 20-minute conversation. I don't think we'll have time for Q&A in the first session. Let's see how it goes. But in our second session with Kathleen Kennedy, we want to be able to do that as well. We have 2 excellent guests to discuss this subject. Let's first welcome the first Minister of Tolerance anywhere in the world today, a person who's worn many hats in the government in the past, from foreign trade now to tolerance, Her Excellency Sheikha Lubna Al-Qasimi, who's going to sit in the center of the stage. And the ambassador to Russia for the UAE, an Arab Russian. So I think it's very interesting to be able to talk about Islam today in the context of what's taken place in Russia and the broader Middle East and North Africa, who's recently put out a book that we're going to talk about that addresses this very subject. Let's give a warm welcome to Ambassador Omar Garbash, the UAE ambassador to Russia. So this is a track conversation, as we call it. So that means we have to stay on track because we have 20 minutes together. So no long answers. And I mean that with the greatest warmth and attendance. I think I've done about 20 sessions with you over the last few years alone. But it's the focus on tolerance, which is a key priority. You come from very different approaches to this. First and foremost, you suggest, in our conversation we had yesterday as the Minister of Tolerance, that when you go abroad, people are suggesting, why do we need a cabinet position with the Minister of Tolerance? Why does the UAE need a Minister of Happiness? Isn't happiness like it is in the United States built into the Constitution? Do you really need to have a ministry for it? But you make a very interesting link, Sheikha Lubna, and that is if you have a tolerant society and you want to welcome the best minds to the UAE and to the Middle East and North Africa to address the Arab rejuvenation that Sheikh Mohammed was talking about yesterday, why it is important to declare tolerance as a cabinet position, and what do you do with it?
Right. Let me backtrack first. Some people look at values that they are inherent as something we take with us from our community, from our society, we take it from our parents, and we take it for granted. But if you look at the formula within the UAE, it's a little bit different. UAE started as a country with wealth, small nation and oil. And going forward, first priority was innovation. Second priority was to establish economy. And And when you talk about economy, you're talking about diversification. So going into diversification where eventually you celebrate the last barrel of oil rather than be dependent on it, you create that by inviting the minds, the best minds of people, the best investors from abroad. So what makes the society tick? What makes it a welcoming society? First and foremost, the nucleus or the core of this is the values itself, where you encourage other people to come in. So if I want someone to live in my society, I have to secure good education for the children. I have to make sure that the lifestyle for the wives is acceptable, and it's something that very consistent with their own. Otherwise, the family would leave. They would not stay here. But even to sustain 2 generations of the family here as investors and businessmen, you need to create an environment that even their worshipping is incorporated. So in the UAE, it's a Muslim country, but we have over 200 nationalities here. We have over 120 churches in the UAE. Dubai alone is 71. So when you want to respect nations living in here, you have to provide for it. Otherwise, it will not be secure enough for them to sustain this. So for us, it's inherent within our system. But in this day and age, and what was happening around us in the Middle East, but also worldwide, I think we take these values for granted. We heard Schwab yesterday at the opening, where he said, unfortunately today, even values are changing. In other words, the changes that we talk about politically or economically or environment, technology, all this disruptive environment that we live in. He said the constant that was in there, the values themselves, even these have become a change at the moment. So why we would leave something for faith to take place? We need to make sure that we institutionalize tolerance. We need to make sure it's in our system. And we look at it from the grassroots. We look at it from cohesive families. We look at it from youth. Youth today, and as you've seen through the summit, are the core heart of everything that we do. We are entrusted as government officials with a legacy going forward that we need to secure a good future. And you have to do that with keeping kids and youth in mind, because today, although they can sit amongst us, but they are isolated. They live in a world of their own. They could be sitting in a living room with you, but their world is totally different. And therefore, the vulnerability of influence, radicalization, can actually hit them in their house while you're not aware of it as parents. So that's why this is a very important core part of the cabinet for the UAE.
Great. I'm going to come back on a number of different issues thereafter. Your trip to Washington recently to the religious breakfast, or the gathering of ministries and the rest, the National Prayer Breakfast, which was quite an entertaining breakfast this time around with our new president. But we'll come back to that in a moment. Can I say? Everything's entertaining, exactly. And we changed our name, by the way, as a network. It's FNN, but it's not CNN. The fake news network. I don't know how that could ever have happened. When I started as an intern in 1984, we used to call it the Chicken Noodle Network. Then it came the Cable News Network, then the FNN. We just dispelled that very quickly. That didn't hold at all. Let's bring in the ambassador. And I think we should address the kind of giant elephant in the room. And I thought His Highness Sheikh Mohammed yesterday, his discussion was very, very bold in a number of different issues. And in fact, on air when we did the program with my colleague Becky, we talked about the discussion that he had addressing corruption, addressing the fact we don't have enough Olympic gold medals in the Middle East and North Africa, not enough patents in the Middle East and North Africa. And he said, how can we accept as a population to use radical Islam, use Islam in the name of terrorism and the link that we've seen in different parts of the world today. You've written a book addressing radicalism today. First, Ambassador, what did you take from the speech from Sheikh Mohammed? And number two, what's your interpretation of how radicalism is linked so closely with Islam in many parts of the world, or with the radical elements of the world, to put it bluntly?
Well, I've been taught that, can you hear me?
Yeah? Yes.
I've been taught on occasions like this to listen to the question and then answer the question that you want. And so what I'd like to first say is that you mentioned in your opening statement that the Arab world consists of 300 million consumers. And I immediately took offense to that. Because that for me,
You have to remember, it came from a financial journal.
No, I do remember.
Context.
But it did make me think about some of the other ways in which we define ourselves as Arabs and as Muslims. And when you said consumers, I understand that is a financial kind of markets approach to the Arab world. The radicals will define our youth as followers and people to be instructed in their faith and to be instructed in how to live their lives. So some of the more glory-focused men of religion will define people as the ummah, to be guided by their great minds. And I would prefer to think of the 300 million Arabs as a bunch of individuals with life plans and with hopes. And I think actually this is part of the book, which is if we focus in on allowing individuals to really flourish in their own right, giving them the broad guidelines, rather than giving them strict guidelines, broad guidelines based on principle, then we're very much likelier to get the Nobel Prizes, we're very much likelier to get the writers and the artists and the creative classes coming out.
Good. Let me follow up about the book, Letters to a Young Muslim. This is written for your sons that are 16 and 12, but also sending a message, obviously, that should resonate beyond your family, of course. What prompted you to write it? You thought it was essential in 2017 to suggest the message has been distorted, as Sheikh Mohammed was talking about yesterday?
I look back to when I was 15 and the kinds of experiences that I had in the mosque and outside of the mosque, and being able to try to kind of live in the modern world while at the same time being told 7th century, given the 7th century conceptual tools with which to analyze the world. Very, very difficult. It come in 2017, 2016, I found that not much progress had been made in trying to bridge the gap between 7th, 10th, and 13th century conceptual apparatus and the modern world. And so what I tried to do was I tried to put myself in the place of a 15-year-old in the Arab world and the Muslim world today and ask whether the questions that I had been answered. They hadn't been answered, and so I tried to put my own answer forward. It's not a kind of a pedagogical. I'm not telling people what to do. Somebody complained that I didn't refer to the Quran with specific verses. Well, the whole point is that really I wanted to structure, maybe orient my son and his generation in a certain way with which to then approach the religious texts, the religious scholars, and authority in general.
Absolutely, yeah, go ahead.
I think Omar is spot on when you talk about how do you deliver religion to children. I think the most important part today that we center, our focus is to put religious values. I think every religion we have, not just Islam, has certain values and spirituality. That's really what religion is to everybody. That's how we were taught as kids. And therefore, you live your life with moral values stemmed from not only your community, but from your religion as well. And what we see today is sometimes the Islamic curriculum is being delivered without the spirituality and the values that are instilled by these religions, and specifically Islam. So what we believe today when you talk to your children, instill that value that comes from religion. All religions talk about not only love of God, but love of people and humanity, how you reach out to help others, how do you volunteer in the community. It's all exists in every religious book that we have on the world. And therefore, when you approach religion, do not take it by text and verses, but take the values in it and present it beautifully to the generation that come. That's how their love will be connected to them.
Well, in fact, you make note of
That's the moral education that now we are actually introducing in our schools, in our curriculum. That's very crucial to us, because I think we don't think about it. We take it for granted that it's inherent and it would just transcend to the next generation. It doesn't. Our parents were like that.
Let me test you a little bit. Do you think the society here became a little bit lazy, not being more engaged, and created a vacuum for the interpretation of radicalism? Is that the problem? We assume that was being passed to the next generation. And there's a direct link. There's the former Minister of Foreign Trade and the former Minister of Economy, where economic development, and Sheikh Mohammed made this point yesterday, is not throughout the Islamic world. In fact, some of the highest poverty rates in the world rest in the Muslim countries.
Absolutely. I think a lot of it has to do with how you present Islam, how you talk to the children, and the way you deliver it to them. Sometimes I think for us, the world was much smaller with our parents. There were certain things, we did not have a lot of distractions. The dream for us was education, that we can study, we can go abroad, we can come, we'll get a nice job, government will look after us. But the kids of today are independent when they're even 5-year-old. So if you have children that can read and they can compare and they can discuss and debate with their parents, then your tools should be different. And that's really the reality today, that you have so many inputs into the child's mind, not yours, but everyone else. And someone can take a verse from religion and then chop it and say, well, this is what it means. So you're falsifying the essence of what religions came for, what humanity means to everybody. So it is important to us as parents, as presidents of universities, as community. We have to know how we deliver this to the next generation. It's a generation that is independent. It is a generation that can stand on its feet and they can learn. They learn fast. But it's a generation that has a creative mind, and they are there to pursue the future of innovation, creativity. We have to handle them completely differently than how our parents handled us.
A powerful message. Ambassador, you made a connection.
That's why we have a young minister here, Minister of Youth, because for us as a responsibility in the government, Hassan Sheikh Mohammed said we have to listen to the youth. Her mandate is to actually bring the to the youth and tell us what they need.
Right, so that's a very fair point. You made a connection between some of the sermons we saw in Turkey before those tragic attacks on New Year's Eve. It was often overlooked in the broader media that the sermons were quite radical, quite inspirational for that strand of individual that wanted to go on to the attack. What do you make of it?
Yeah, absolutely. I mean, it's a very important point, and I'm actually very glad that the sermons in the Emirates, for example, is an example where the government has actually come in and spoken to the religious establishment here and said, you've got to really realign yourself with a completely different set of approaches. So, no more of the aggression and the hate, which I remember very clearly in the 80s and the 90s. And that had an effect, It actually sent people away from the mosque on Fridays. People would say, I don't want to be, on a Friday, I don't want to be politicized and moved and angered by, these guys who only get to speak once a week, I suppose. And so, you go to the mosque these days and you'll find actually there's a very different message. And it shows that this is a choice we make, and as a society, it's a choice that we make. Nobody stood and protested the change in the sermons from aggression to positive thinking. Yeah? And it's something that can happen right across the region.
May I ask a more sensitive... Go ahead, yeah.
For the sermons in the UAE...
You're adding a lot of them now.
if you look...
Basically, you can do what you want. You don't need to add.
If you look at the backgrounds, within the UAE, because we really didn't have a lot of national sermons in here. They were caught a lot from abroad, but it just happened that people carried their political agenda and their biases with them when they came to the UAE. So the sermons were definitely sometimes had given a message that we think it's not the right message here, because it doesn't really in tune with our well-being in the UAE and the culture that we have. So the government actually directed the Awqaf here to start looking into a program where they take the sermons here, and now they've gone through this beautiful program where within this program they told them what the essence of Islam, what are the moral values, and how you present in the mosque. And all of a sudden you see unified, consistent message that talks more about value than these hatred messages and politicized messages. And I have a great example. When I went to the national breakfast prayer, I took 5 people with me. I took 3 churches, St. Andrews and Abu Dhabi. I took the Coptic church and the Armenian church from Dubai. And I had 2 of these advisors actually, and they were young, they were in their 20s. And they spoke beautifully to our youth, the university kids in Washington, D.C., about how they value. And they told them, go back to the truth. There are a lot of fatwas right now. There are actually databases within the UAE and Al-Azhar as well, where it defies this negative rhetoric that is very anti-other, other nations.
So it's being bold enough is what you're suggesting.
Yes, we're taking a courageous,
Yeah,
because what it is we believe in Islam, and we know what Islam is all about. But what we see today is not Islam. Islam is being hijacked. So for us, it's the only way to do it is you need to divert it back to the roots, to the grassroots, and the best way to do it is to start by the sermons. And now you see a complete different aspect of mosque and what they deliver. And to add to it, I have seen programs where even these sermons would go and talk on voluntary basis with students at schools. So now they start to create this love for religion to the children by bringing people who can actually speak the truth.
With the prayer breakfast, I think it's a good launching off point to look at the very quite radical populism we see in the United States. We saw the vote, I suggested in my opening remarks with Brexit, Marie Le Pen potentially giving a good run for the money as president of France today. What's happening? What's the interpretation here? We want to put up the wall to Muslim countries. You had the travel ban against 7 countries.
I think that in itself has created a lot of animosity within the States and worldwide. We've seen the protests that are taking place. But we can't look at that in isolation. I think this rising populism is happening worldwide. And there are deep-rooted reasons for that. And I think Christine Lagarde spoke about it yesterday, that while we actually shifted, it's almost like a pendulum that goes from one extreme to the other side.
Yeah,
and
it overshoots.
And what you need to do is you always push it back to the middle. And what's happening worldwide is why we have globalization. And the idea of this is access to market, where you benefit. We have seen the rich getting richer and the poor getting poorer. So there's now a wealth divide. And this wealth divide created a lot of negative sentiments, including the US. And within this, a lot of it is people saying, well, the jobs are not there anymore. But the true message of this is not about, I lost my job for another country. There is a rising technology change, a disruptive technology today that's changing the world and it's taking it in a whirlwind. Today, you see robotics and the way you see artificial intelligence. When I was in DC, I went to visit the children's hospital there. And I was amazed. This is the research center that UAE actually sponsored by $150 million. This particular center, I was looking at robotics where they do surgery for children, where it has probably the least invasive surgery where the children can recover. You see artificial with 3D printers where they're looking into tissues of human beings eventually where they can actually print human tissues. So the technologies out there have changed the map of the world. So when I look at this from the global perspective, the change is happening. Everything is changing around us, and we need to be prepared for that. But when you talk about the Muslim ban, I think the thoughts, I mean, this is a sovereignty issue within the US in terms of demanding what they want. Whether the intent of this was actually to defer terrorism from the US, maybe the way it was delivered, the message was not really the right message. And we have seen the backtrack of this now with the US government where they're looking at this to really put the right articulation for the ban itself.
Are you talking about those so-called judges that made that interpretation? 3-0, the so-called judges? I'm not sure where they came from.
I don't know where the so-called comes from.
From the president himself. Ambassador, go ahead.
I think there's a great deal of focus on the Muslim ban, and perhaps too much. I think, if we look in the region, many countries in the region also place bans on similar countries, so we shouldn't be particularly surprised. But the more interesting element for us to, I think, look at is the way in which the American Constitution is demonstrating that it actually works. And there was a big question as to whether this was permissible or not. And I think that's actually much more interesting to see that you can have a president who wants to do fairly radical things in his own right and represent a nationalist populist position, and he's being prevented. And I think that's really quite fascinating. And if we think about our societies and our political systems, perhaps we can learn also from that. The idea of constitutional law is not just a myth, it's not just an ideology and propaganda, it is actually something that can be seen to work in very volatile situations.
Well, as an American, I would say it's straining our system of checks and balances, but to your point, it is working, and in fact, linking back to your point earlier, that investors were looking to see if the system would hold up with the radical challenge. Now, you made a very interesting point about globalization. I have a premise that we had the fall of communism in 89-90, the lowering of trade barriers in 92, the creation of the World Trade Organization, and then the revolution of digital economy. 1995 and onward. What influence has it had on your, if you will, your home market of Russia? How are they interpreting radical Islam today? This real push to globalization, and then this push for nationalism, which has been present in Russia as well.
Yeah, I'm not sure that they're succeeding in their globalization strategy given all the sanctions that have been placed on them. So actually what's happening now is that they're developing their economy internally, so there is now a lobby within Russia that is in favor of keeping sanctions in place because they have a captive market. You know, the beef industry has started up, you know, Parmesan cheese is now produced in Russia, and various kind of Italian alcohols are also produced there. So, you know, in that sense, globalization has had a kind of a negative effect, right? You know, you're either part of the system or you're not. In terms of kind of their approach to radical Islam, you have to remember about 18% of Russia is Muslim, and I've interacted with quite a number of them, and they are aggressive, interesting. They have a very clear sense of their own identity, and they are very also radical. I mean, a large number of them are playing a role in ISIS and in Syria and Iraq. So the Russians are looking at this from a historical perspective of a difficult relationship with Islam going back almost 300 years. And so I think, for them it's not a surprise that there are these radical elements, and they come down on them very, very firmly. So they believe in the iron fist approach.
Yeah, in fact, I was going to ask you, if we had this conversation even 3 years from now, is it going to change? Well, people say we sit here and we use the UAE model and the interpretation of Islam and tolerance and the connection to youth and the connection of happiness. Is it going to get much worse in the next 3 years because of this nationalist and populist fervor that we see today, Sheikh Aluna?
I hate pessimistic thoughts. To me, I'm an optimist. And I think we should move from being defensive toward Islam by being firm, by being positive, by sending out the right message, by being out there. I think 50% of the challenge happens when you sit there and you confront this and you look at solutions. You think, what is it that we should be doing? If we have the right message here, this is a society that has 200 nationalities. It's a Muslim society. We have others living here. So who talks about Islam? This is a Muslim society. We have a good example. This is a society that others can look at, and they can see and look at the success of things happening in here. But 3 years from now, to me, much more crucial than that is if we want societies, Muslim societies, to move forward, or even other societies, we need to tap into the wealth of the youth. Today, if you talk about Nobel laureates, or you talk about patents maybe 15, 20 years ago, the age range was different. We're getting into a phase now, a decade, where the patents and the geniuses are 15-year-old and 17-year-olds. So when we look at society, in order to reduce the negative rhetoric, you need to tap into building and contributing to the well-being of the youth. So you look at it by creating the right programs, you look at innovation, you encourage them, you see the business models that actually can lead these kids and have them in the forefront. Today, the guys who make the mega bucks in the US are the younger ones, they're not the old ones. You know, the modus operandi of creating wealth is no longer real estate, and you look at kids with certain technology, and you just need one application, and the wealth changes immediately the minute you look into the maps. Today you look at Facebook, people look at it and they call it, or Twitter, this is a nation by itself. It's like a universe in its own. So we need to think in that line. And then for tolerance programs, or looking at any values, we need to bring this as the essence of it and build with it. But you can't build this in isolation without not looking at the reality of what's happening as we go forward.
Good. We're knocking at the end of our time together, but I wanted to give you one question, the same question to both of you, and I'll start with the ambassador and have you finish up. I thought it was fascinating yesterday because it was a discussion about Arab revitalization, and His Highness Sheikh Mohammed said, this is the model we have. I'm not going to imprint it on you, and I'm open to all different formulas, but he didn't want to impose it. Do other countries rise to the occasion here for the greater Middle East and North Africa and actually come up with different formulas, or embracing the formula that works today? Because poverty is part of what we're discussing. First Ambassador Govash, and then Sheikh Alumna, if you can wrap it. We have, let's give you a minute each and then we'll close. Thank you.
I may take less time. The way I look at it is that we do have an amazing model in the Emirates, but I would be personally interested in understanding how it is that it came about. And I know that there are many fantastic initiatives taking place, but the theory behind it, the understanding, the principles that are actually at work, is something that we really need to think about. It would be some of us should be thinking about, so that when the Libyans turn up here and want advice on how to do it, then we can actually explain it to them, and we can actually help them kind of localize success in a Libyan environment.
If I speak about my government here, we walk the talk, we lead by example. So if you want to influence others, bring the positive contagion of your whatever initiative that you have. And UAE has a history of this. People defied us. Dubai Ports Authority and the furor that had taken place, if you remember, I was
2004, right?
I was in the midst of it. I was just appointed as Minister of Economy. And at
That's
the time,
before we met and you were doing an interview with Wolf Blitzer trying to explain that.
and if you look at that time when people said, wait a minute, this is a Muslim country, it's going to rule the world. Look where Dubai world today.
Yeah.
Look at the highest building here in Dubai, Burj Khalifa. Who would have thought this would be built in Muslim Arab world? So everything people told us you can't do, we said we can. So it's the attitude of His Highness, Sheikh Mohammed bin Rashid, who says, take the positive attitude and can-do attitudes, move forward, and people want to move with us, then that's fine. And the most specific part to me that resonates in my ear is it's like a running river. Time is an essence here. You go forward. You don't have a pause button or a Microsoft delete or undo. So watch your time, move forward, because if you're not, you're not
I like having an unscripted